Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our YouTube live series. Today, I'm joined by
Echo.
Echo. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, Echo. And today we're digging deeper into our topic of the month, which is showing empathy in the online classroom. So it's a bit of a new one for both of us, I think, but very, very interesting. We've found some really amazing research for this. Our specific title today is Teaching with Heart: Effective Empathy Strategies for Online ESL Instruction. So it's kind of just a fancy way of saying we're going to talk through some practical ways to bring empathy back to the center of your teaching style in online classrooms. And I think one of the first things that came up when we were looking at this, Echo, is the definition of empathy can be quite difficult to figure out and be quite hard to pin down. So, Echo, I think you found a couple of different definitions. Is that right?
Yes, so I did some research, and interesting enough, it actually came from a German word. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but I will try. Please be empathetic with me. So it's Anfühlen. So this is the origin of the word empathy. So the meaning is actually a feeling into. So empathy is, interesting, right? So empathy is actually the ability to recognize and share another person's emotions. And I think to achieve that, so probably you have been in a very similar situation, or you have been in a similar experience that trigger that similar emotions that you can empathize with. Yeah.
Right.
And for me, I really like to quote one of the novelists. His name is Hamid. So he said, empathy is about finding echoes of yourself in another person. So I like this saying very much because obviously it has my name in it. So I can definitely resonate with that. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So the first one there, Einfühlung, your pronunciation was pretty good, I think. My German is also not very good. So I trust you on that one. But I think that's from Edward Titchener in 1909,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
so this goes all the way back over 100 years when people were starting to kind of define this very complicated concept. So that was very interesting for me. The quote that I found was actually from some emotion researchers at the Greater Good Science Center at the infamous UC Berkeley in the USA. And the quote that I found is quite academic, but we can drill down into it a little bit. Their definition was empathy is the ability to sense other people's emotions, coupled with the ability to imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. So I think to strip this down a bit, there's kind of two parts to empathy. It's partly to do with what you could call your emotional antenna, your ability to pick up on how other people are feeling. So there's that part. And then the second part is kind of to do with your imagination, your ability to relate to that person and put yourself into a similar situation to help understand how they feel.
Exactly. I'm so glad you mentioned this one because that really reminds me of the three types of empathy. So, so as you mentioned about emotional antenna, right? So that's one of the empathy called affective empathy. So that's like feeling with the heart, right? So,
Yeah.
like I mentioned before, you don't necessarily have to go through the emotions, but then when the other person feels down or something, you can sort of remind you of the similar situation that when you were feeling the same. Like melancholy or something, and then I think for some female audience, you might be in a situation where you listen to your girlfriend talk about something and you start crying with her. So this is a very typical example about affective empathy. Another
Right.
two, yeah. So and the other two is one is about empathize with the mind, right? So it's called the cognitive empathy. So that's like when you're basically going to other people's train of thought. I really like that analogy. So like you're following a person's path in their mind and to think about, oh, this must be something that you're feeling or you're thinking, right? And the last
Right.
one, I think for yeah. And the last one is I've got some like coach friends and they told me that so they can feel something in their body as well. So yeah, so it's actually called somatic empathy. So for example, so as a coach friend told me, every time she listened to something tragic and she can feel this kind of pain or like literally the physical pain like in her thumb or something. So
Wow.
that's, yeah, I find that really, really quite impressive.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Um,
Thank you
yeah.
so much for your description of those three types of empathy. I think that's definitely cleared things up for me. One of the
Hmm.
things that I kind of needed to figure out in my own head when I started looking into this topic is empathy versus sympathy, because I
Hmm.
think in everyday language we use these two words to mean pretty much exactly the same thing. And if we want to be slightly more academic about it, it was important for me to define the difference between the two in academic senses. So from what I found, there's a lot of technical language involved, as you might imagine, but one of the easiest to understand explanations was that sympathy is to feel for you, so showing concern, but not necessarily based on a shared experience. But empathy is to feel with you. So it's trying to find that shared feeling or that understanding because of a shared or similar experience. And I think it's kind of the
Hmm.
difference between if you say that you have a headache. To be sympathetic,
Yeah.
I can say, oh yeah, that must be rubbish. I'm sorry to hear that. And empathy is to kind of try and find something to help you understand how that person really feels. So thinking about, oh yeah,
Mm.
I've been at work with a headache before.
Yeah.
That was so difficult because of this and that. But yeah, as you mentioned, we have these three separate types of empathy, and I think they all come to the forefront in education as well. It's such an important part of education. It very often gets overlooked, I think, and it particularly in online classes. So, Echo, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why it's important to develop empathy with our students, and particularly why it's important in online classes.
Yeah, so I think as teachers, we all want to build good rapport with the students, right? And then, so in online classrooms, it is actually even more challenging because I'm experiencing this right now. So even if like, we're doing the live, and sometimes there can be a lagging, in the sound. So I feel like my reaction is 2 seconds later, right? But then I think you're empathized with the situation. So. Um, and then if this is the first time you're doing this, it's incredibly daunting, right? So then you need the other person
Mm,
to really feel how you feel, and then just sometimes you just need that tap on the shoulder, like I know how you're feeling. Like it is perfectly normal. Many people,
right.
you're not alone in this situation. So I think lots of students will need that, especially in my experience, lots of beginner students when they start their English learning journey, or any of the
Mm.
languages, after they turn 30 or something. So it's really difficult. So to have that person to be there, tap on the shoulder, say you're not alone in this, is incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree. That's such a interesting point about adult learners as well. In particular, I think there's a certain level of empathy that we need to explore there, especially with our adult online learners. And one thing related to this, I think, is when I started to think about being more empathetic in my online classes, and exactly like you said, Echo, in online meetings, especially because we have that physical distance between us, it's a bit more difficult. Um, I found that it was necessary for me, and I think in general, to be proactive with this. So it's one thing to kind of sit there and say, "Oh yeah, I'm very empathetic," but to be truly empathetic, you need to kind of work on it, and you need to take active measures towards this.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think, yeah. Please go ahead.
Oh no, I'm just curious about these measures, but I'm sure that we will talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in just a minute we can start talking about some of the strategies, and we definitely have a couple of really good ones there for sure. But yeah, with online classes especially, as you were saying, it's super necessary because we have this increased distance between us. One of the bits of research that I was looking at is actually from Boland at the University of Michigan, and they did this study into things like Zoom meetings and virtual platforms,
Mm.
online classrooms, and they found that actually, because of this lag that you mentioned, it tends to disrupt the normal rhythms of speech. And human beings, we have so many tens of thousands of years of evolution about being next to each other and having conversations in close proximity to each other that our brains, our subconsciousness especially, is still getting used to this new kind of communication where you can kind of see a picture of the person, but their responses are all very, very delayed, right?
Yes. Exactly. So,
Mm,
and I think one of the things you mentioned about maintaining eye contact, right? So I remember, so when I'm doing this live now, I specifically brought a shelf. So, so the camera is actually at my eye level. So I feel like I can
right.
actually look into the camera when I want to talk to you guys. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I have exactly the same thing, except mine is made from some old textbooks.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, so I think empathy is very important. Sometimes you need to be more intentional of the things that you're
Mm,
thinking and doing, and then so that so that you are demonstrating real empathy, not the empathy that you think that you're doing, right? So
exactly. Yeah.
I think John, you also have some like good ideas about like self empathy, right? And
Mm.
we also prepare like lots of the metaphors for you guys in a minute. So I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to hearing you sharing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, one of the really interesting, kind of more accessible sources that I found, because, we looked at a lot of fairly high ranking academic peer reviewed research. I also dug a bit into more popular takes on this. So, podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I found this amazing one from Naomi Toland and Dr. Anita Novak. And Toland has a podcast called Purposeful Empathy, and I'll put a link into the chat in just a second. It's really, really good. They have an amazing episode called An Educator's Take on Empathy. And one of the ideas that they explore is that as educators, our choices have a massive impact. So if you think about how many billions of people there are in the world, and you think about how many people of that total are going to have some kind of interaction with a teacher at some point, it might just be kindergarten or a couple of years of primary school, might be all the way through medical school and into doing PhDs, for example. But like most people have a bit of an experience with teachers. So their question, Novak and Toland were asking, what impact are you going to have? And they think that the best way to do this is to be proactively empathetic and really kind of have not just uh, an effect on your students' lives in terms of their learning, but also just in terms of a human interaction. Quite interestingly, actually, this year I was at the IA TEFL conference in England, in Harrogate, and there was a man there speaking called Roy Cross, and he's been in the industry, the ESL industry, for a couple of decades now, I think coming up for 30 years. And one of the ideas that he touched on was that everyone remembers a teacher. It's almost like, whoever has ever had a teacher, you can ask them, who was your favorite teacher at school or kindergarten or whatever, and they'll have an answer for you. And what he was saying, Roy Cross was saying that it's the reasons that people like their teachers is never really because of what they were taught. Nobody ever says, oh, yeah, I loved my history teacher because I love history. It's always something else. And it's very often to do with their empathy, how empathetic they were, what human interactions you were able to have with them. So I thought that that was really interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
mm,
yeah, that's very interesting. That reminds me of one of the teachers. If you ask me who my favorite teacher is, I'll probably say like my trainer that I was doing the certificate. Um, is it okay for me to share this story right now?
please. Yeah.
Yes. So I remember, so she told me that sometimes you prepare like lots of lesson plans, right? It's like you carry a suitcase into the classroom, right?
Hmm.
And you are already prepared to open this and say, okay, today we're going to talk about this. This is the lesson aim, right? And then one of your students might say, oh, I just had a really bad day, or I got fired, or maybe my cat was in like terminal stage or something. And
Hmm.
then she said, you literally need to put down your suitcase and then go with the student. All the things you
Okay.
prepare doesn't matter anymore. Yeah,
Mm.
you put this suitcase away, and then just really focus on student, focus on the moment, and to like empathize with that student first. And John, you have something about shoes as well, right?
I do, yeah. While you were talking about suitcases there, it resonates a lot with what I was about to say about shoes. So Dr. Novak in this podcast that I was listening to with Anita Tolland, they were discussing the idea of shoes. And in English we have this phrase to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, to wear somebody
Mm.
else's shoes, anything like that. But what they were trying to get across is to truly put yourself into somebody else's shoes, you have to take off your own shoes first. And this is a metaphor very much to do with your suitcase, putting down your own suitcase, removing yourself from your own mindset at the time, and then kind
Mm.
of trying to strip things away as much as possible to get into the other person's mindset. And yeah, they were just saying it's very difficult to do that unless you kind of
Mm.
clear your head before attempting it, which I thought was
Mm.
yeah, a really interesting way of looking at it, and obviously has a lot of crossover with your suitcase analogy. So I think we're very much on the same page with that.
Yeah, definitely. So because we talk a lot about empathy, right? And sometimes when people tell you a lot of things, and you carry the other person's either shoes or suitcase, right?
Mhm.
You can be quite tiring as well. So I think so. Is there any way that we can do to take care of ourselves first, to empathize, to have the self empathy first before we can take care of others?
Sure, yeah. I think for this, it very much depends on the individual. How you want to be
Mhm.
empathetic with yourself is very much down to the person. But practicing things like mindfulness or even meditation in general can really help educators get in touch with themselves. And again, harking back to this podcast, one of the things that they were discussing, I actually have a quote here. The quote is from Dr. Novak, and she says, "The more that I was being intentional with my own choices and more intentional with understanding myself and my learners, the more I could be intentional with the choices I was making." So, exactly like you were saying, Echo, the idea that to truly be empathetic with other people, you really need to look after yourself. That definitely had a lot of resonance with me. It's something I found for myself. As an educator, for sure. I think many people have this. They tend to hold themselves to a very high
Mhm.
standard, and they tend to be more forgiving of others compared to themselves. So yeah, I think what they were trying to get over in this podcast is that if unless you really spend this time digging deep into yourself and working on yourself, you're never really going to be as empathetic as you otherwise could be.
Mm, yeah, because I think there are a lot of people talking about glass half full or half empty, right? So like, well, sometimes we're very eager to fill the other person's cup, but then before that, I think we need to make sure that we have something to fill. So first of all, we need to think about we're in a good state, a
Mm.
good physical state, emotional state, and then we fill our own cup, and before we can fill others. So I remember one of my colleagues always told me that never deliver training session or any of the coaching session when you're hungry, right? So like
Yeah.
don't
Okay.
schedule back to back sessions. Yeah. Like always allow breaks so that you are prepared, like you hug yourself and before you can deliver psychological hugs to other people. I find that very
Right.
useful. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, that's such good advice. I think just for the workplace in general, but especially for teachers. And I think,
Mhm.
for online teachers, that can be quite difficult sometimes, right? Because
Yes.
maybe you have back-to-back classes
Mhm.
all throughout the day. I know of some teachers who do 45 to 50 teaching classes per week, which is very, very heavy. And yeah, I think mindfulness and self-empathy for those people is incredibly important, and trying to figure out how to
Mhm.
schedule things to best suit yourself and your students is a really important part of that. You're right. um, Echo, one thing I was wondering is with your background being in China, I was wondering if you have any different perspectives on this to do with Chinese work culture at all.
So I think, especially in big cities like Shanghai, so
Mm.
we're working in a very fast-paced culture, right? Fast-paced society, and then I think the cultures sometimes we tend to be a little bit hard on ourselves.
Mm.
We might be quick to criticize ourselves. I don't mean to generalize here. I'm sure like everybody's different,
Hmm.
but then I would just take myself as an example. Sometimes maybe the thing the thing I imagine the impact is much higher than the thing that actually happened, right?
I
So
see.
for my Chinese fellows or others, you might feel the same way. Please don't be too hard on yourself. Yes.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that. I currently live in Switzerland, as you know. Although
Mm,
I grew up in the UK, I spent a lot of time in China. And Switzerland also has a bit of a reputation for being quite hardworking and rigid. They tend to work quite long hours. They tend to take
mm,
slightly fewer holidays than some of their European neighbors. So I think a lot of your advice there definitely resonates with some elements of Swiss working culture as well. So thank you so much
mm.
for sharing. Now, Echo, I was wondering if we could explore. I think we have four different strategies here to think about in order to show empathy to our students in the online classrooms.
Yes.
So, I was wondering if you could go ahead and share your first one.
So I think the first one is basically active listening. But then I think to achieve that, we first of all need to really normalizing people's emotions. When a
Mm,
student tells you that I'm really not feeling well, I don't feel confident enough, and you can say, it's okay, I've been there. And I feel like, especially, I think for myself, because English was my second language, so that's
mm,
why I think I can totally relate. Because I also study English. For the viewers, maybe you are currently learning a different language, really use that. Because that will be the good resource for you to share with your learners about what it felt like for you when you first started learning pronunciation of a new language and conjugation and all of these. Yeah. And for active listening in online classrooms, really make sure that you can manage your facial expressions, because sometimes we might not notice, right? Sometimes we may be like, oh, and we don't know that because we just did it so subconsciously. So a good advice will be maybe record yourself and doing a speech, so that you know what you look like on camera. Um, and then, as I mentioned before, just maintaining like eye level, make sure that your computer is placed at a place where you can actually look into the camera.
right,
Oh, I think early on you mentioned teachers have classes back to back, right? So
right.
if, for example, all of your classes happen on the dot, so then of course you cannot just say, "I'm sorry, I have to take a break" to your student, right? Because for your student, it's just a new class. For me, when I work from home during COVID times, the very important thing is to change your location. You have no idea, or change your background. If you're using virtual background, change your context. Context is key in everything. So once you move there, your body, your mind will be refreshed. Yeah, and then that can be your, even if it's just for 1 minute, that will be your 1 minute breather. Because now you feel
Mm,
like, okay, so now I'm teaching in front of the ocean, if that's a
right.
virtual background, or I'm
Yeah,
teaching in
sure.
front of grass. That really changes. Yeah, try that out.
That's such a good point. I've never really experimented with different backgrounds before, but yeah, that's an incredible and very very valid and immediately actionable change that I can make to kind of give myself a bit of a break when I'm working remotely. So thank you so much for bringing that one up. Um, One of the strategies that I found is kind of to similar to something that you mentioned a bit earlier, but it's kind of to do with keeping your opinions to yourself and not in a
Mm,
negative way, but I think importantly to do with empathy, because empathy is so much to do with relating things to your own experience. It's important to relate it to your own experience while still recognizing that in that moment, it's not really about you. It's still about the other person.
yeah.
Um, and especially, I think, with online teaching, because we're dealing with people from so many different backgrounds and so many different cultures with so many different points of view and ideologies, really trying to find a respectful way through that can be quite difficult sometimes, I think. So, yeah, one of my key strategies here, I think, would be to be cognizant about what opinions you're sharing and making sure that you are not sharing anything that you think could be controversial to this person or might make them feel slightly unsafe.
Yeah, definitely. Hmm.
Right. And
So
the last
yeah,
strategy, sorry, go ahead, please.
yeah. I was just going to say, like, sometimes in the online classroom, instead of using the verbal, right, strategies, are there any non-verbal, something to do with body language that can be useful?
Yeah, yeah. So I looked at some empathetic body language, and quite interestingly, I found a pretty famous study by Melinda Fouts, who's a doctor, Dr. Melinda Fouts. And the quote that I pulled out from her abstract is that around 55% of communication is body language. So some people say
Mm,
55, other studies have found 58. I have another quick quote somewhere, which is from Albert Merabian, actually, and he calls it the 58 38 7 formula. And this is that 58% of communication is nonverbal, 38% is vocal, but only 7% is actually to do with the words that you're saying, which, in the ESL industry, it's very important for us to remember this, I think. So in terms of the importance of body language, it's, almost up to 60% of our communication is to do with body language. And while we're teaching online, this can be quite difficult, especially for me. I can't see, but I use my hands a lot when I'm talking like this, and I don't even know if you can see my hands. So I wonder how much of my meaning in communication is already lost through that. So yeah, I think my first strategy for this would be, if you're doing things like using your hands or gestures, remember that because of this distance created by these digital spaces, we're not in a physical classroom, so we need to overemphasize them. And to begin with, maybe you'll feel a little bit foolish, I don't know, but yeah, really emphasizing your gestures is very, very important for being empathetic in the online classroom, to make sure that your meaning is communicated properly. And very much
Yeah.
related to that, yeah, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, because you were mentioning about body language. I just remember something that the online classroom can do that others not. Is like we can always use some emojis, right? So on Teams,
Right.
on Zoom, I feel like they have developed so much to engage our any of the viewers audience since 2020. You can always
Mhm.
send a heart, send a reaction, and then people will put their hand up or you do like a confetti or something, and then I always engage our learners and also to show some empathy. Yeah.
That's such a good point. Yeah, leveraging things like emojis, which I think so many people are familiar with now because texting is such a large part of so many people's lives. People can kind of read that as its own language. So utilizing that
Mm.
in the digital space for teaching, very, very important way of being empathetic. That's really true.
Mm.
And
Mm.
then related to what I was talking about with body language, to be empathetic, we need to make sure that we're kind of fully present. So a lot of this is to do with active listening, like you said. But while you're active listening, it's important to kind of think about what your face is telling the other person. Because if they're talking about their feelings, if they are making themselves vulnerable, then if you just sit there and you kind of stare at them while through the computer screen, then it's not going to make them feel like you're really paying attention. So, a few tips that I found from around the internet. First of all, is to relax your face. I'm sure you've worked with people who constantly kind of peer at the computer screen like this. Maybe they're reading notes, but it can feel quite threatening, right? So, being aware of what your face looks like and relaxing your face. Also, exactly like you said, Echo, trying to make as much eye contact as possible is very important. And nodding your head while somebody is expressing themselves can also help them to feel that you are really listening to them and
Mm.
understanding what they're saying. How about you? Do you have any sort of tips about body language or what to do with your face when you're being empathetic online?
I'm just reflecting on my facial expression while I'm listening to this.
Sure.
Because I remember, I feel like this is my empathetic face. I was going to ask you, John, like, do you have
Mhm.
a particular empathetic face that you show? Because this is when I show really real interest in people's conversations, and I will lean
Right.
my body. I will have this brow movement. Do you have any?
That's super interesting that you mentioned that. One of the two main things is to do with eyes and especially eyebrows. I don't know if you've ever seen online what people look like if they accidentally shave their eyebrows off, but it means that they can kind of not show expression anymore. They just constantly look surprised, right? So
Yeah.
that's the eyebrows are so important with this kind of
Mm.
empathetic teaching. So I think the face that you were just showing me looks absolutely perfect. You have this yeah, eyebrows going up and down and soft eyes. Yeah, how about you? Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes because what we show might not be what's being encoded, right? Decoded. I feel like
Mm,
people understand different emotions differently. So I think sometimes being overtly with being very open and transparent, with your listener or student at the
right.
beginning of the class is also very important. For example, for me, as you guys have noticed, I have quite a rapid speech. So then but when I teach, I try to slow down, but I know it's going to be unnatural if I speak really slowly. And then I will
Mm,
just tell my student, okay, if I speak really fast, then please tell me. But then that's also because I'm very passionate about what you're trying to say. I'm trying to actively participate in your conversation. So for body language, you can also say, I would sometimes if I do this face, it actually looks like this one, but I actually mean this. So that you have the common understanding between what you're showing and what they're getting.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with that. And for the record, I don't think you speak too fast, but I'm sure when you're teaching, especially beginner level students, I'm sure you slow right down.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I see where you're coming from with that. The only other bit of advice that I found in relation to this was when it's time to respond, when you're listening to a student's feelings, one thing that you can do to be more empathetic is to reflect back to them what you heard them say by maybe
Mm.
paraphrasing what they said. So,
Yeah.
if you have a student telling you how they feel about something, then you can say something along the lines of, okay, thank you so much for sharing that. And then kind of saying, like, oh, so from what I understand, you feel like this. And then that's going to show your student that you have truly been listening, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to paraphrase for them.
Mm.
But yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I think we can
Yeah.
possibly leave it
Oh,
there. This is Yeah. Go ahead, please.
sorry, just one thing, because I feel like we
Hmm.
talk a lot about sharing and something, right? And some one very important thing and very difficult for everybody to do is to allow silence. Because
Yes.
especially in the online world, sometimes when you speak, you can actually count to three before you speak, because maybe you think it's okay to speak. This is when the internet lagging happens, right? And then allow thinking time is probably one of the most important thing I learned, from coaching. It's like
Mm.
when your students not speaking, it's not because they don't know, but then they're actually processing. Maybe they try to structure like the best syntactical sentence or whatever. So give them time so that they don't feel like they have to rush to an answer. That's also like sort of like hidden empathy, I would say. Mm.
That's such a good point. Yeah, that's interesting. I was reading articles about this in relation to empathy as well, and yeah, it's difficult, I think, in online classes to leave this silence because the modern world is so fast paced. But also with a lot of online platforms, you'll have a timer. So every second that ticks away, you think, oh, we need to be filling up this
Mm.
time with language and language production or language practice. And actually, yeah, all the studies say you're exactly right, Echo, that this silence, it needs to be there. It's a really fundamental part of the learning process.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Echo, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, of course. And thank you to the viewers for tuning in. You'll actually be able to access this recording at any time on our YouTube channel. It's under the Lives section. So feel free to watch this at your leisure and add your own comments about strategies you use for showing empathy in the online classroom. So thank you again, and we hope to see you again very soon. Bye.
See you. Bye bye.